Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with English jazz pianist and composer John Escreet. He talked at length about his latest 2018 CD, Learn to Live, and over the course of his career, he has earned a reputation as one of the most active and diverse pianists and composers working in jazz and improvised music. His prolific output is reflected over the course of 8+ diverse and critically acclaimed albums. He hit the scene in 2008 and has been running hard ever since. He's full of stories and so much more, so get to know him and dig this interview, my friends.
John, thanks for taking a minute out from Neon Jazz. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So let's go ahead and talk about your latest release, Learn to Live. It's another evolutionary step, or it's another unique stamp that you've had and a pretty prolific output that you've had either as a leader or a sideman. Talk to me about this new album.
Well, it's the first album of composed material that I've done in about 5 years, because the past couple of albums were totally improvised. But obviously I've done many albums of composed material before, and my habit is to document bands and occurrences as they kind of happen and evolve naturally. So the previous summer, I had done a quartet performance in Europe with Greg Osby and Eric Holland and Matt Brewer, and it was really fun. So my initial intention was to kind of just document that. And then, fast forward to February, just before the recording, I had some other performances in New York, which was a different quartet with Matt also on bass, Nicholas Payton and Justin Brown. Those gigs were really fun as well. So I knew I had this recording coming up a couple of weeks later, and I thought, well, if these guys have just played all this music and like just totally destroyed it, and it's fresh in their minds, it makes no sense to leave them off the recording. So long story short, I just decided to involve everybody and kind of mix it up and have everyone play at once and have two drummers play at once, and it just kind of came together like that. And luckily everyone was available, and everyone was very enthusiastic, and I'm really happy with how it turned out.
Beautiful. Let's talk about your childhood, where you grew up and how you got involved with jazz.
Oh, okay. I grew up, I'm from a town called Doncaster in Yorkshire in the north of the UK. Oddly enough, it has a very strong kind of youth music, a youth jazz music scene up there. So I was, performing in big bands and stuff, when I was relatively young. And, so that kind of, nurtured my initial interest in jazz. And when I was a little bit older, 14 years old, I went to a specialist music school, like a pre-college music school, boarding school called Sheathams. And that was more of a classical kind of school, and I was encouraged to kind of work on that side of my piano playing. But I was always interested in jazz, and it was kind of obvious to the people at that school that I would eventually go off to college and probably, pursue a jazz degree, which is what I did. And then I went to London to do my undergrad when I was 18 years old, and then 4 years later, when I was 22, I immediately came over to New York, and it was initially supposed to be for a couple of years, and basically I've been here ever since. It's been 12 years now, and it's just an endless kind of learning experience, which is, it's very fulfilling at the moment. It's great.
Without a doubt. So what early jazz albums did you listen to that really got you going?
It's hard to say. I mean, there were just so many from back then. I remember, some of my early jazz albums that I was introduced to. I remember when my piano teacher first played me Keith Jarrett, and I was just kind of blown away. Particularly an album, Live at the Deerhead, was one of the first things I was introduced to. More so than that, the thing that got me into jazz when I was even younger than that was just in 1990s UK television. There was like live music on TV a lot of the time, and there were jazz musicians that I knew who were also kind of doubling as session musicians, and popping up on TV performances here and there, and just to see real people playing live music, that I knew who these people were, just spotting these people on TV. So just even seeing these people on TV, even if they were playing behind a pop artist or whatever, and knowing who those people were, it was very inspiring to me, and that was kind of another option of, what music can be,
So I'm always interested in cats that grow up in other regions of the world. Is it kind of ingrained in you at an early age where if you're going to become a musician or get into jazz that you need to come to New York or the United States to really kind of further yourself in a direction that's going to be more fulfilling? Is that a true statement?
that's a debatable statement, and I'm sure, like, depending on who you will ask, you'll get a whole diverse range of answers, very valid answers as well. For me, it was necessary as a person in my early 20s. I needed that inspiration and that kind of kick up the ass, so to speak. It was just that the style of music that I was into at that age, a lot of it was being played in New York, and at that period as well, living in London as a teenager, it was kind of, this is in no way disrespectful. It was kind of clear to me. It was apparent pretty quickly, what the limit was, career-wise, which is not necessarily the case today. The scene is a lot different now, and it's a lot more expansive, and it's a lot better now over there than it was when I was there. But for me, just certain styles of music that I was working on, it just happened to be the music that I was most interested in, was being practiced and executed over in the States and in New York. And, I connected with a couple of these people, and, a couple of musicians in New York planted the seed, in my head, you might want to think about coming over here and checking it out, and I think you would do well here. And, so for me, it just seemed right. And then, when I arrived in New York, it was just so overwhelming, but in a good way. Just being surrounded by just, so much genius talent, and the level was so high. It was just, as someone in my early 20s, it was exactly the inspiration and the push that I needed. Having said that, I don't think it's absolutely necessary, and I think it's really specific to, each individual person's case. For me, it was necessary. At that moment in my life, it was definitely necessary for me. But, if you may be into a different style of music, or if you have a different, career line in your sight or something like that, it's not necessary. People stay over in Europe or other parts of the world and have, develop their own artistic voices and, make very good and valid creative music. But, it just depends. I strongly believe that it depends on the individual. For me, it was definitely necessary, and, very glad that I did. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to do what I do now. It's that simple,
Right on. So in 2008, you get a master's degree at the Manhattan School of Music, and you study under Kenny Barron and Jason Moran. That had to be a huge learning experience for you.
Yeah, definitely it was, and, just having access to those kind of piano players as mentors was a big enticing factor for me moving over to the States. First year studying with Kenny was really fantastic, and obviously I've known and been aware of his playing for a long time. And even though we are stylistically, very different, I got a lot out of the lessons with him. It was, we would mostly just play, piano duets, which was just a learning experience in itself. And he wouldn't really impart specific, things for me to go and practice and work on. He would just suggest things. This is also the true sign of like of a really, true and honest musician. Like, he could see that I was going for certain things and that I was a hard worker and that I was really trying to develop something, even though it wasn't fully formed at that point or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, he could recognize that I was going for something and that I was a hard worker. So he was just, throwing his weight and support behind that, even though he might not be in that kind of area of music himself, but he would just offer what he could, and I would take, what I could from him, which is extremely valuable. And then in the second year when I studied with Jason, someone who's maybe closer, to me aesthetically or whatever, and I was also, a big fan of Jason's playing, so we got into some more specifics there, and, Jason was, I don't know, he opened my mind up in different ways, and also he made sure I was, checking out some older piano players that, often get overlooked, and then he was just kind of, filling some gaps in my piano knowledge, and then also just kind of opening my mind to the possibilities of what this music can be. Yeah, I would say both experiences were very different, but like really fulfilling in their own ways.
Absolutely. Now, on paper, and I think probably in reality, it seems like when things start for you, it's pretty magnanimous. It's big and it goes. And your debut in 2008 was Consequences with David Binney, Ambrose, Matt, and Tyshawn. That had to be huge to have such a veteran group of cats that were so talented.
Yeah, it was wonderful for me, and like just, to to take my mind back to that, because I was feeling a bit nostalgic recently, because that was 10 years ago now, and I remember a couple of months ago I was like, wow, it's like the 10th anniversary when we made this album. So I was thinking about those old times, and I mean, it was, talk about a learning curve. That's the reason I moved to New York, just to be surrounded by people like that, and just to play regular gigs, and like to have this incredible group, which was my first group. I mean, can you believe that, as a young person who moved to New York and I just take that group on the road? It was really remarkable, and it was just mind blowing. What you also have to remember at that time is that it was very much a working group. Like we were doing lots of little gigs at the 55 Bar and other places in New York. That band actually played my final recital in Manhattan School of Music, which, like a few weeks before we went into the studio and recorded Consequences. But basically, my final recital was Consequences. So it was very much a working unit. And even though you talk about those guys in terms of veterans today, back then they weren't really veterans, maybe with the exception of David Binney, who's, a little bit older than everybody else in the band. And Dave was, an extremely important mentor to me in my early days in New York. But, back then Tyshawn was young, Ambrose was, you know what I mean? Like, they all became, very rightfully huge, important musicians and names in their own rights now. But back then we were just all doing little gigs and making music. And, it was kind of a trip for me. It was amazing.
The one thing that I always notice from more specifically UK jazz musicians, and this isn't exclusive, but it's something that I notice more and more, there's so many influences that go into what you're doing, whether it's Zappa, classical, electronica, funk, there's so many things that go into it. What was it about where you grew up and what you were accustomed to hearing that really helped you kind of broaden that horizon and get such a signature jazz sound that you have?
I don't know, to be honest. And the thing is, I've tried to pinpoint, where these influences might have come from over recent years. But I don't know if it has so much to do with, where I came from or where I grew up, because, I feel like a lot of those influences kind of, creeped into my musical world, maybe a little bit later on, like when I was living in London, for example, I was very much a jazz purist, and I was only listening to, like, mostly acoustic jazz and stuff, but I was being opened up at that time to some maybe more obscure, I mean, not even obscure really, but, more left field piano players like Andrew Hill or Paul Bley or Cecil Taylor, people like that. But, when I moved to New York really, and I was like, wow, the musicians that I like David Binney and like Tyshawn, they had all these other diverse interests. Like Tyshawn was listening to all kinds of, contemporary classical music, and Morton Feldman, and David Binney was into like, rock music and electronica music, and I just saw that the musicians that I admired, their musical world were just so open and so vast, and I was like, wow, I want to be like that. And it wasn't just like a forced situation, I had a genuine interest in all of this stuff, I mean, I guess going back a little bit, I did study some classical piano music when I was, 14 years old and stuff, but I wasn't really that into it back then. When I was younger, I kind of rekindled my love for that a little bit later on. But then, of course, I'm always, proud of certain kind of UK musicians that I really like, for example, Evan Parker, who I've since had the good fortune to collaborate with. But then also there's kind of, I guess when you look back at it, there's a Northern English kind of music scene where a lot of, famous musicians like Alan Holdsworth and John McLaughlin, and a lot of kind of, quote-unquote fusion musicians. I didn't realize that all of these guys were kind of from my backyard, so to speak. So I don't know if it's, I don't feel that it was an early influence because that's where I came from, but I just kind of, when you get a little bit older, you start to kind of look back at the lineage of this stuff, and I just have this broad interest of all kinds of things.
So in the 10 years since your debut album up to right now, what kind of changes have you seen on the jazz landscape that's been very encouraging for you?
I don't know. That's a tough question, because I feel, in some ways a little bit less connected to what's going on with young musicians right now. I mean, I try and keep an ear to the ground and stuff like that, but I'm kind of very much involved still with musicians that I grew up playing with. In New York, sometimes the jazz scenes are not so integrated, and that's not a good thing. I see people, for example, there's like a Lincoln Center scene, there's a 55 bar scene, there's a small scene, and like the scenes don't really seem to mix much, and I think that's harmful and detrimental. I have a genuine interest in all of those different things, and I hang out and try and be present at as much, different places as possible. I guess, people have a broad interest of music in general, I guess, and that kind of helps the jazz scene. Like, the definition of what jazz can be is more expansive these days, and there's a good music scene in Los Angeles, for example, like Louis Cole and Genevieve Artadi, these guys who I've known for a while, had this band Noah. They're getting a lot of popularity now, and it's not really jazz, but it's at the same time to me it is jazz. There's just the world has become a lot smaller and a lot more integrated, despite what I just said about the jazz scenes in New York, actually, but it's just the possibility of what jazz can be seems to be like blown wide open, and I think that can only really be a good thing, to be honest.
Without a doubt. Why do you love jazz?
I love improvising, first of all, and I guess I always did like improvising when I was a kid, so, therefore, when I discovered jazz, it seemed like a perfect fit, it seems more creative to me because it's different every time. I love classical music as well, of course, and performing that, but there's no feeling like being on the bandstand or being on the stage and communicating with, fellow musicians in real time and, like, really improvising. And it's the unknown element. I guess that would be the main reason that I love jazz. It's the unknown element and the element of surprise. I think that's when people's, true musical personalities really shine in those settings, and that's when you separate the men from the boys, so to speak. Like, the musician's true qualities shine in those settings, and it's exciting.
Let's say you have a dream tonight, and you run into yourself 10 years younger, around 10 years younger, when you come to New York, and you have the opportunity to give your young self advice based on all of the veteran musicians you've been around and everything you've seen to this point. What advice are you going to give to your young self?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. Just not to, I guess the best advice would be not to rely on other people and to have expectations, but at the same time, I don't know, just to work harder and practice harder. I mean, I have worked and practiced hard, but I would just say be even more diligent. Don't place all your eggs in one basket, and don't rely on other people to make shit happen. Like, you have to only, it really falls on yourself, I guess, would be the summary of that,
So this is my final question for you, and it is this. Everyone has a perception of you, your family, your friends, and your fans, but you know yourself best. So tell me, who do you think you are?
I don't know. I mean, again, interesting question. I just think I'm John Escreet. I'm a kid that moved over here from the UK. I'm now American as well. Like, America is my home, New York is my home, and I'm just a guy trying to make some honest music that I hope will bring some form of pleasure and enjoyment to other people. I'm just trying to put some positivity and some good out there in the world, which is definitely much needed at the moment. But that's all I'm trying to do. I'm trying to contribute positively to the world.
Beautiful. John, hey, thanks for answering some tough questions, taking some time out from Neon Jazz. I appreciate it, man.
You're very welcome, and thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to yet another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in England, the United States, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to John for his music and his time. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store. Visit neonjazz at youtube.com, and for everything Neon Jazz, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.